Hey guys, in this video we're going to go over specifically the balance changes from today's update, July 23rd, 2024, with the new heavy metal season out. First thing we're going to talk about is the anti-tank guided missiles minimum arming distance and acceleration improvements. Overall, I think both of these are kind of a nerf, and I'll explain why here in a moment, but let's just read it real quick. ATGMs are being updated in two ways: minimum arming distance and improved acceleration values. Now, firstly, minimum arming distance, obviously that means less shotgunning, right? And that is a current issue in Cold War of these fast little light tanks, or tank destroyers in the case of the Weasel and some others, running up on you and shotgunning you for 1400 damage or even an ammo rack. And there was nothing you could have done about it, especially with some of them being so concealed. So this is to minimize the run and gun playstyle of missile tanks to just get up and close and personal and just blast you away. Now, as it reads, minimum arming distance is the distance the ATGM needs to travel until it is armed and can do its full damage and penetration. With a minimum arming distance, when you are too close to your target, the HUD will have an X over your reticle and a note that you are too close. And we can see that right here. New HUD element will communicate when you are too close. If you're farther than a minimum arming distance, the HUD will appear normal. So you get this little X and a massive indicator saying too close. You can still fire the ATGM, but as the missile is not armed, the damage potential is reduced to only 25% of its base damage. And its penetration is only 75% of its base value. Now, there's multiple arming distances, and it says here, ATGMs will be set to one of two values based on the vehicle, 65 meters or 100 meters. The minimum arming distance and the percentage of damage and penetration when not armed can be viewed on the tank's detailed stats page. It seems like there's a parity here where tanks with only missiles will have a shorter minimum arming distance and tanks with regular guns with missiles will have longer ones. But I checked, a tank like the Bradley actually gets the 65 meter minimum arming distance despite having a machine gun, while a tank like the Martyr A3 actually gets the 100 minimum arming distance despite having a machine gun as well. So you'll have to check individually which minimum arming distance the tank you're playing with missiles has, because it is not a set rule. Now, there's not much more to be said about this, as this makes total sense that within this meter's distance, if you're shooting at a tank that is 64 meters or closer, you will have 75% of your penetration value and do 25% damage. Now, there's also a new audio for when you hit a tank within your minimum arming distance. It will now do a new doink impact sound when it did not arm, and a new icon as well to show that your missile kind of failed. Now, as for acceleration, in addition to encouraging a farther engagement distance with the minimum arming distance, players also provided feedback that ATGMs feel too slow. The slow speed is likely a contributing factor for players using a tactic more like shotgunning with this weapon type. To address this, the acceleration values for ATGMs have been increased so that they'll quickly reach their max speed. The new acceleration will greatly decrease the time it takes to hit a target, giving them better usability at range. The acceleration rate for impacted ATGMs is currently 20 to 40 meters per second and is increasing to 80 to 145 meters per second depending on the ATGM. Now, this does not increase their max speed, but it gets to its max speed a lot quicker. And personally, you can see this both ways. Whereas this is clearly a nerf, the minimum arming distance, and it is a good nerf. It is their fourth in a row good Cold War change, in my opinion. This one can be seen as a nerf or a buff, right? If you're one of those players who just sends the missile straight at a target, is standing still, this is a buff to you because it's going to take less time to get there, which also means less time standing still yourself, because most of the time when you shoot a missile at distance, you're sitting out in the open pretty much because you have to have line of sight on the target and you have to guide that missile into that target. So say you got spotted when firing the missile, because firing the missile lowered your concealment, that's more chances of you getting shot while the target or while your missile is heading towards your target. Now that the missiles are faster, you spend less time out in the open and you spend less time aiming that missile. But this could also be seen as a nerf because it might make guiding missiles a lot harder. Now that they're a lot quicker, you don't have much time to change the trajectory, turn the corner quicker, or even do maybe the javelin strat of sending it up and then going straight down, right? This might make it more difficult to do some like trick shotting with missiles, right? So either way, the acceleration portion of the missile changes could be seen as either a buff or a nerf, or, as I'm personally willing to see it, as both. Either way, I do like the sound of these missile changes, and less shotgunning is definitely something that I am happy with, despite not playing Cold War myself too much. But moving on from the missiles, and before we get into the major balance changes of this patch, we have the low tier autocannon update. Now it says here low tier autocannons are receiving an update. Some lower tier guns are autocannons with the burst fire. One trigger pull equals 3 to 5 shots, right? With this update, this will no longer be the case, and these guns will now act like normal autocannons. This will enable the ability to fire a single shot per trigger pull instead of multiple shots per trigger pull. And the following tanks have been updated with these changes. And of course, it is a lot of low tier tanks, right? The Renault FT, which is the tier 1 French, D1 a tier 2 French, Renault FTAC, L640, Renault Otso, Chinu, Thunder Bucket's a major one because the Thunder Bucket just got nerfed. Now it's getting the low tier autocannon update. The TKS 20, some Polish tanks, some Swedish tanks, some Russian tanks, and another Swedish tank split from the other Swedes. I believe that's a Swedish tank. Anyway, now this could be seen in multiple ways as well. Personally, though, for some of these, I actually don't like it. I actually think it was quite unique that some of these tanks acted in the way that they do. However, I think some low tier autocannons are keeping this because I don't see a Stuart on here, and if I'm not mistaken, the Stuart has one of those guns, right? So some of these tanks aren't changing, but these are the ones that are. And for the most part, a lot of the balance changes we're about to go over also go over some of these tanks. So I'll point those out when we get there, and you'll see what those mostly mean. But let's get into that now. So here we have 5 nations. Now, I was hoping the American tech tree would get buffed, and the Pershing particularly, but that has not happened yet. Maybe next time. But we'll start off with Poland. Now, Poland, immediately the 7 TP, and you can see this is most likely its low tier autocannon, right? It's getting a little pen buff in its standard rounds, view range buff on its top and bottom turrets, as well as turret traverse speeds. Now, that's just a tier 2. It's not even in the game anymore unless you still own it. And the tier 3 is getting mostly the same, a view range buff, as well as some aim time reload and pen values on its 37mm. Now, its 47mm also getting a quite substantial reload buff and accuracy buff as well. But tiers 2s and 3s, how much do we really care about that? Tier 4 getting sort of the same thing. Again, the 37mm makes its return on this vehicle, and some other of its guns are getting some pen buffs and reload buffs, as well as aim time and accuracy buffs. Now, the tier 5, this is where it starts to really matter, in my opinion. The HP of this tank is actually going up to 830, which it doesn't show us what it went from, but other tanks will. It is also getting some reload buffs substantially on its 75mm, but I believe this is the one that is its top gun, which is just getting an accuracy buff. As for a tier 7 now, this is on the heavy line for the Polish tanks. This one, again, also getting an accuracy buff on its 90mm, as well as some terrain resistance buffs and updated physics. Of course, this was just like last time. We don't really know what updated physics means, but hopefully it is an improvement. Now, tier 8 actually got quite a substantial buff. On its 122, it's going from 14.6 to 14-second reload time, and it's gaining 10 meters base view range, as well as some terrain resistances on medium terrain. The biggest things here is obviously, though, its reload buff on its top gun and 10 more meters base view range. Now, the tier 9 is getting something interesting, but it's only to its stock gun. It's getting a full second reload buff on its stock gun. Now, this tank does get a 130mm top gun, so this buff's not too insane, but What is insane is the 400 meters base view range it now has, which is typical with tier 10 heavy tanks, and it's nice to see the tier 9 gets that as well now, which is pretty good for it. Now, the biggest thing for the Polish tanks is the CS63, which was always one of the best tanks in the game that is least played by players. And it's interesting to see that this is getting nerfed in the way that it is. Yes, this is a nerf. And there are a few more nerfs in this list, like last time, that I actually agree with. But this one, I'm not so sure about. This is a 390 Alpha 105, right? And the power of this tank is always the fact that it has its speed mode, which makes it one of the fastest tier 10 mediums, and it can get into position very quickly. But in speed mode, you have a lot of accuracy issues, as well as actually, I believe, a camo decrease. And we're going to actually make that worse in rapid mode, giving it worse aim time than it already has, and even worse accuracy for both shot dispersion penalties during movement and rotation, and just during turret rotation. We're also nerfing its regular shot dispersion penalty and accuracy during rotation while not in rapid movement, and nerfing its aim time by 0.2 and its reload by a whole half a second, which makes this one of the worst 390 alpha DPMs in the game now at tier 10, and it's only better than the E50M. So this is quite a massive nerf to this vehicle. I believe it drops its DPM by nearly 200. And that's going to be quite an impact. And again, I'm not sure if that's exactly what I would have done to the tank. But that's what they're doing. And so if you're a CS63 player, sorry, but you just got the DPM nerf of a lifetime. Moving on from the CS63, we actually have one of the cutest tier 2s in the game, the TKS-20. And this was also in the low tier autocannon update. So its 20mm now can shoot like a regular gun with an autoloader, and now has a much better 5-second reload time instead of 6.2, better aim time, and it actually got some armor buffs that I don't think are going to make a huge difference, but it did get 30 more hit points as well. So this is a little bit of a surprise to me, but a lot of these low tier autocannons you'll see are getting some buffs. Now with Japan, we have the tier 1 with getting some autocannon adjustments, as you can expect from the rest of this list. There's going to be a lot of low tier autocannon changes, and most of these changes you'll see on multiple vehicles. With tier 2, you have the Type 89 getting terrain resistances, aim time, pen updates. A lot of these low tier tanks are getting pen updates as well. And again, most of these tanks still aren't in the game, and I said this about last time, but this is all probably in advance to tier 1s and 2s being brought back into the game. And personally, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with bringing back tier 1s and 2s, and I actually think it would benefit new players, as currently new players being either forced into Cold War Era 1 or being enticed and encouraged into Era 1, I should say, with their free T95E3, or immediately starting with only 2 tech tree lines at tier 3, where they're already fighting tier 4 players who love certain vehicles like the Hetzer and whatnot. And then immediately going into tier 5 battles with their tier 4 next. Tier 1s and 2s coming back, even if it's against bots for the most part, would be nice for new players to get a grip on the XP requirements, how the game works, the upgrades, the consumables, and all that, while not being bullied by markers in Cold War or by low tier seal clubbers in tier 4. And so a lot of these buffs you'll just presume are for their tier 1 and 2 return. Otherwise, why would they be putting so much effort into these tier 1s and 2s? Again, more tier 2s, tiers 2s, tier 3. And I'm sort of skipping over these because most of these are the same. They have the same guns, like the 13mm autocannon from the tier 1, the 57 from the previous 2 tanks in these tier 2s have the same gun. So most of these are all the same thing, right? So move on to tier 3. There's only one, the Type 97. Again, 57mm gun. You recognize that name up here, getting the pen buff. Tier 4 is where things start to really matter. But again, some minuscule buffs here that ultimately don't really change much. Now, the tier 5, the Type 3 Chinu is actually getting an HP buff, and that is to match something like the Chinu Kai. So this vehicle has 675 before the update, but it will now have 750, and that does match the Chinu Kai's 750 HP, and it's getting some accuracy buffs on its guns. Now, this 5mm gun is actually a typo. This is the 75mm gun Type 3, also getting an accuracy buff just like the other 75mm gun. So when you see this, don't think that this is the machine gun on its port. This does not have a secondary weapon, and it is not getting a buff to its secondary gun because it doesn't exist. This is a typo for a 75mm gun. Now on to tier 7, we have aim time buffs and a reload buff on its 75mm gun Type 5, and that's pretty nominal, but it's nice to see. The biggest thing is its turret traverse speed actually being increased by 7. That's quite a big number, and 39 is not terrible, but we'll take that big of a jump. On a tier 8 with the STA1, it's actually getting some reload buff on its 90mm to by 0.5, which is a substantial increase, as well as a significant 106 standard shell speed increase as well as pen on that standard round 2. So 232, that's actually quite a big buff that I like to see on the SDA1. And personally, I might actually pick this up again and play it, seeing as you're getting 0.5 reload, which we saw with the CS63 nerf was 0.5, and that's a substantial DPM decrease. So this might be a substantial DPM increase, as well as the standard rounds being much more effective. Now with the tier 9, it's kind of doing the same thing, standard shell speed and pen on the 90mm for both of its turrets. And here we get to another tier 10 nerf. And this one makes much more sense. Now, while they're nerfing the 150mm, they're actually buffing the 140mm by a full second on its reload time, kind of enticing you to, hey, this gun exists, you might want to try it out, because the 15cm is actually getting a 3.2 second reload nerf and an extra 0.1 second aim time, as well as worse accuracy by 0.02. Now, personally, I think the biggest problem with the 150mm is the 1300 alpha damage on its HE, giving you such big significant splash, but I am perfectly fine with this nerf. So this nerf gets my approval, unlike the previous one with the CS63. As for the premiums, again, we're just doing some 37mm stuff in the low tiers, but when we get to the STA2, there's 3 variants of the STA2, so they all get the same thing. But its 90mm is basically getting the same treatment as the STA1 and the Type 61, where its standard pen's going up. And now this tank actually had worse shell speed than the previous 2 tech tree tanks, but now it is also going to match with 1020 standard and 914 premium shell speeds. And it's actually getting an HP increase by 30, which isn't huge, but the big thing is 20 more meters V range. Now that is huge. And so these are all preferential tanks, the STA2s. So it's interesting to see that they're getting the same gun as the STA1, which is obviously not a pref tank because it is a tech tree tank, while most presumably staying pref. So this is another case of like the FCM 50 ton, where tanks that are pref have penalties to them to make them pref. And now it seems Wargaming are removing those penalties and making them just as good as the tech tree tanks. So I'm not sure how I feel about this one personally, but this is obviously going to make the STA2 feel a lot better. Is it necessary? Probably not. If they're going to do this, I would presume we would remove the preferential status on these tanks, but that would obviously piss off a lot of players who might have bought these tanks for their pref status. So I personally probably wouldn't have given them the pen increase and the shell speed increase, but the rest of it is okay, like the reload time, the aim time, and the accuracy, and maybe even the view range I'm okay with, and the HP. Like, I'm okay with everything else, but I would have kept the pen and the speed lower, as they, again, are preferential tanks. But that's just my personal thoughts on what we're doing to these pref tanks, because some of them just don't feel pref anymore. And personally, for them not to feel pref anymore, for them to feel like they can fight tier 10s, but they just don't because they're premium vehicles, is an element of pay to win that I'm not enjoying seeing. And as much as I love the STA2 to get buffed, might have gone a bit too far in the non-pref department. Anyway, moving on to Germany, we have again some low tier caliber guns, some autocannons, most likely getting some buffs to their reloads. Now, this 2cm, you're going to see 2cm a lot, so 20mm in these German tanks, and that's what most of them are. So we're going to kind of skip through a few of these. And so personally, we're going to skip through a lot of them. Again, look at all these 2cm, right? So a lot of these low tiers. Now this one we're going to stop and look at because this is an artillery piece. It is a tier 2, but it is getting a half a second aim time buff and some shot dispersion penalty buffs for whatever reason. Don't know why, but again, we continue to buff artillery after the artillery 2.0 buff. Annoying. Tier 3, again, you see some 2cm, you see 3.7cm, 4.7cm. You see a lot of these low tier things getting the same thing, right? 5 to 15, 6 to 8 this time around. Also a reload nerf. Some max ammo buffs to some of these as well. Personally, the only one you probably know or care about is the Panzer 1C, and it's also getting only 20mm changes. So I don't know, again, if I want to say these are nerfs or buffs, but depending on how many of these used to shoot per shot, per trigger pull, this is either the same amount or a decreased amount for a longer reloads. So if you are personally a low tier player that knows these statistics, you tell me whether or not you deem this a nerf or a buff. The Panzer 3J is actually getting an HP nerf, and a view range nerf. That's probably the most important thing about this, as the rest are probably the same situation. It's also getting a reload nerf on its 75mm, so that's interesting. Panzer 3E, 2cm, another artillery buff. This time on a 15cm, so 150mm, getting an accuracy and aim time buff, as well as a max ammo buff and dispersion penalties. Now, tier 4, the Lux, getting, again, the same treatment on a lot of things. This one, a straight-up nerf with the 30mm. The Panzer 38NA, again, same 2cm stuff. This tank, still not back, wish it would be. The tier 5 Leopard, getting the same 3cm treatment, but not exactly the same, as this was just a reload nerf. This increases the clip size with a reload nerf by quite a substantial amount for only 4 rounds being put into the mag. And we're already into the premiums because, again, most of that stuff was just low tier autocannon changes. And the premiums are much of the same, except for the Grob Tractor, which is getting a massive increase in its HP, a reload and aim time buff for its 75mm drip gun. And personally, I think I'm going to try this tank out again, because this was always one of my favorite little shitters down at tier 3. And so it having, 85 more HP and a better reload and aim time, it sounds like a little bit of fun. So, and yeah. Now, importantly, the highest tiered German vehicles getting changes are the Adler VK 4503 and the Tiger 1 Hammer, which are both becoming 280 alpha guns. And I did the math, and this actually is a DPM increase on the Adler, despite it being a full 0.9 second reload nerf. This was on the Hammer, a full 1 second reload nerf. Didn't check the DPM value on that one because I didn't really care, but the Adler did get a minuscule DPM increase. So that one, I will play it again. I believe the Adler did just get buffed. Now that it's 280, I'm willing to try it once more. Personally, I did think it was a good tank, and now it might even be better. Now, moving on to Sweden. Sweden, again, we have low-tier autocannon buffs. So it is a bit disappointing that this time around the buffs aren't as substantial as they were before, and for the 2 tier 10s that we've seen so far, they have been nerfs. So I know that the perception on this balance change might be super negative, as there are a lot of low tier shitters, and the tier 10 buffs or the tier 10 changes were actually nerfs. But again, we're gonna kind of blast through some of these low tier ones and start moving on to really the tank destroyers are the ones that are the most interesting to look at, as the tier 3 tank destroyer got reload and accuracy buffs as well as a view range buff from 300 to 315. For the tier 4s, you have some random buffs here, but on its 75 millimeter, a decent reload buff on the Lago. Sav M43, which is the tank destroyer, gets an aim time and accuracy buff on its 105 millimeter, but a pretty big reload buff on its 75 millimeter. It's better 75 millimeter, as this is the stock one, this is the upgraded one. But if you choose to use the 105, you don't get a reload buff, but you do get an aim time and accuracy buff. That is a derp gun though. So personally, I would use this 75 millimeter, especially now with that insane reload buff. And it also got 40 more meters base view range on a tier 4 Swedish tank destroyer. 350. The tier 10 has 370. So that is a pretty huge increase, especially since this is all the way down at tier 4, right? Moving on, we have the one, another medium tank getting reload and aim time. IKV 103. This also has a derp gun. It's getting an accuracy, aim time, and reload buff as well on both of its guns. Although with the top gun, it's only getting reload. So this one's less substantial than the tier 4, but that tier 4 one's pretty big. Tier 6, only the tank destroyer, reload buff as well from 8.2 to 8. That is pretty big. And some aim time, as well as an HP increase from 685 to 700, which is also huge. But the biggest thing is the view range, man. From 330 to 390? Whoa! When did we decide that these low-tier Swedish tank destroyers get to spot for themselves? That's crazy. This was always one of my things about the Swedish tank destroyers, was they got the biggest indirect nerf in the game, in my opinion, with the 6.0 update. These tanks are all about being stationary and being like sentries, right? And because of that, you would put camo nets on them, and you would put binocs on them. And camo net didn't increase the moving consumption of light tanks, but now it does, right? And so light tanks get to get closer to you without being spotted because you lack binocs, and they have more moving consumption than they ever have before. And so I did think that these Swedish tank destroyers kind of got shafted with 6.0, and the sentry role kind of being neutered. But they are giving them substantial view range buffs, and we'll see if this continues further down the line. But tier 6 having 390 is huge, especially when it used to have 330. So that is definitely something to pay attention to. And now with the tier 7, we'll see if that continues. But firstly, with its 90 mil, it's only getting an aim time buff, but it is getting a view range buff from 340 to only 360. Now, I have no clue how they come to these decisions. I have no clue how this is decided, but for some reason, they decided that Tier 6 can have 390 meters base view range, while the Tier 7 can only have 360. And this isn't a case of me not knowing that, oh, this thing does already have 390 because it's got a second turret. No, these are non-turreted tank destroyers, so there is no second turret. This is it. The Tier 6 gets 390, the Tier 7 gets 360. Again, not sure how they determine these values, but that is it. The gun didn't really get much, though. Now, the Tier 8, the 105, got a better aim time in drive mode. Not sure why most of these gun buffs are in drive mode, but that's it. In siege mode, you're actually getting better turret traverse speed, which is pretty good, by full 10. And it is getting 360 view range. Now, it says siege mode specifically. So are we actually doing this to where you have to go into siege mode to get your max view range? I highly doubt it, but I'm just going to presume this siege mode didn't need to be here. Just going to presume that didn't need to be there. But the only gun buffs it's getting are to its drive mode, which is where you can't aim, really. So this is not that big. 10 more meters base view range, not that big of an increase, but it exists. And then that's it. We go on to the premiums, which Again, Tomte, we remember that from the autocannon update. So this 20mm is just its autocannon. Big reload buff, though. Big reload buff from 5 to 2.9. Toldi, reload, or not reload. Yeah, reload. Reload aim time accuracy, more view range as well. And then we get to the Sturv S1, which is getting the same kind of treatment as the UDES, where it gets to turn quicker. In siege mode, it's got 10 more meter space view range, which I guess is nice. And then its gun buffs are only to drive mode, and that goes for the Stark Sturv as well. So that's weird, in my opinion, but the 10 meter space view range and the turn speed is all you really need to know about, because the drive mode, aim time and accuracy, I mean, who is really shooting in drive mode in those vehicles? And if you are, you're probably shotgunning someone in the mouth because they're literally fighting you. So reloading or aim time and accuracy in drive mode doesn't really make a difference in my opinion. But anyway, under the Earthshaker, a tank that was given out for free quite a while ago, so of course it's going to get a buff, and it's got a massive buff from 13.1 to 12.2 seconds reload on his 390 Alpha gun at tier 8, which is a pretty big DPM increase, very large DPM increase, and that's probably the biggest thing about this this buff to the Earthshaker. Primo Victoria also getting a reload and aim time buff, but this is a less hard-hitting gun, I believe at either 230 or 240. So, but this is nice. This is nice to see. Sturv 81 is just an unskinned Primo, so it's going to have the same stuff. And then we're on to France. Oh, wow. Are we really on to France, though? These are just the autocannon update tanks. Again, in that low tier autocannon update. So France, just tier 1 and tier 2. Probably the biggest disappointing tech tree in this update for sure. Now, again, most of this was just low tier autocannon updates and 2 tier 10 nerfs. The biggest thing to look at here, in my opinion, is probably the Sturv line. Having those good DPM increases in bottom tiers and those odd view range increases throughout the tech tree line as well as the Sturv and the UDES getting much more faster turn speed in siege mode. That's probably the biggest improvements on this list, because the rest, again, were just low tier autocannons. So if we're going to highlight this list, Type 5 nerf, but also buff, very good. I thought it was good. CS63 nerf kind of felt unnecessary in the way that they did it. Could have done it in different ways. And then the Sturv line buff got something interesting. And the Tiger 1 hammer and the Adler VK are now 280 alpha guns. And that is your synopsis for this balance update, really. So you have ATGM minimum arming distance and acceleration, and a low tier autocannon update, and then a few major buffs and nerfs in the balance department. So let me know what you think about this update. I thought it was very weird. I thought it was disappointing for sure, as most of it was stuff that you don't really care about in the low tiers. Either way, that'll do for this video. If you want to know the rest of the seasonal news, I did make that a separate video, and I will link that here at the end of this video. If you came from that video, though, I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching both of them, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.